What is it like living in Mexico? Today we wanted to share our personal experiences that we have gained living in different parts of Mexico, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm joined here by Josh, he's a US citizen, and Ksenia, she's a citizen of Russia. Now, let's start out talking about the very best experience you had in Mexico, and where was it? You want to start out, Ksenia?
That's very difficult. I think I had a lot of great experiences in Mexico. I guess the main thing that I would like to point out is, well, first of all, because I speak Spanish and I passed daily C1 before I came to Latin America. So basically, a lot of my needs in terms of the language are very different from people who come to Mexico just to start from scratch, maybe never studied Spanish in the past, or maybe had like a very elementary level before they moved, and now they are facing the reality of having to speak Spanish. But I had great experiences, especially studying at the university in Mexico City, which is one of the best universities in Latin America, and it's the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And I would like to really point out that probably one of my best experiences was especially taking literature classes there. So maybe not really an experience that a lot of people who never studied Spanish before would be able to take advantage of right away, but just my favorite professor, one of my just favorite professors from all over the world, of all the places where I studied, like one of those professors taught me there and taught me literature, especially Mexican literature. And so I think that the quality of education there is actually very good. I think that, because I studied in Russia, I studied in China, and I also studied in Mexico, and I can tell you that if you compare a lot of your experiences in terms of even just the ethics of education, ethics of research, I think that Mexico is very close up there to the standards that a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the US are looking for. They really respect the copyright, they really respect the good, proper research, no plagiarizing and stuff like that, because that is very common in, for example, Russia, it's very common in China, even though obviously all countries now talk about those very high standards for education. But when you're actually a part of the education system, you start to notice that we're really still very, very far from that ideal that we want to reach. And I really think that Mexico, at least the Autonomous University of Mexico, has done so much to actually achieve that. And you can tell from the ethics, from the the teaching practices that the professors there have, that like they're really succeeding at that. And so I think that if you're looking at cheaper options especially for education somewhere else, if you can't afford it in your home country, I think that's the closest you can get to really high quality education, at least from my perspective, if you speak Spanish especially. And so that was probably the most just eye-opening experience for me, because if you just live somewhere, and especially as a tourist, you don't really get to see just how professional and how capable some of the specialists that they have in the country are. And so I took classes with this professor twice. I had first one course online, and then the second time when I enrolled in the program there, I also just, the second I saw his name, I told the office, I want this class. I just want to be this professor's student. It was amazing, and like seriously, just such a gifted man. I really think that there are some professors, some really good professors I had in Russia and I had in China, for example. And in my personal opinion, if I were the head of the admissions office, for example, I would make sure that every single student in my university takes at least one class with this professor. And so I feel like I met a lot of those professors in Mexico, the people that you really want to learn more from. And the class is over and you still feel like, I need 2 more years with this professor. What? It can't be over. And so I think that probably the best experience for me was actually just the educational one, which is something that I had in a few other places, and nowhere else was I really left just very pleasantly surprised with the quality of education that you can receive.
Very good. Very interesting point. What was one of the best experience or the best experience you had in Mexico? Do you have a shared experience, or what was like number one for you, where you would say this really made Mexico worthwhile?
I guess you could kind of say it's shared. Like it's hard to point to a single experience and say that, this was my absolute favorite, because, we've spent a lot of time in Mexico, like a year and a half in total, something like that, over the past 3 years, on and off. And yeah, we've just enjoyed our time there. Like it's, mainly for a few specific reasons that it's not ideal for us, but I absolutely love the food. It's also pretty different from, what most Americans would imagine Mexican food to be. So, it's a very interesting, exploratory experience. I also really appreciated, all of the moments that we had just learning about Mexican history and culture because, knowing about Mexico, like it's our neighbor and stuff, but it still felt very far away, very different. And especially if your only exposure to Mexico is like through
Media.
either, different news or any sepia filtered scene in a movie or a TV show, anything that depicts Mexico as just desert. Like being in Mexico, for the most part, is a very different experience. And Mexico's history is very much it's inseparable. It's intertwined with American history, and so like there are lots of very familiar, very homey things in Mexico that I just didn't really expect to experience there. Like, it is different. The culture is different, but there are a lot of things that, like ideals that we have in common. Like, in general, like no matter what kind of, where you are on like a political spectrum as an American or whatever, like Americans in general have placed a very large emphasis on personal freedoms and liberties. And that is something that you also see in Mexico. It's very, that doesn't sound very significant, but it is. Like, in a lot of other places that we've been to, everybody enjoys their ability to speak freely, or everybody enjoys their ability to, do whatever they want, or, have enough money to be able to afford to enjoy their hobbies or whatever. But in a lot of different places, their ability to express themselves freely might not be as important as their ability to feel safe, an ability to, feel as if there aren't like terrorists lurking around every corner or, what have you. And so that balance is different everywhere. But in Mexico, it feels very similar. Not necessarily the same, but very similar. And in Mexico City, there are so many different museums, and one of my favorite restaurants, Casa de Toño, has very good, very cheap Mexican food, and I could eat it, for every meal every day. But there are also some of the coolest museums, like the Anthropological Museum in the Chapultepec Forest, the Templo Mayor, like right in the middle of Mexico City. It was very interesting just to kind of like understand, just what was going on. What did Mexico City look like before the Spaniards came? And, like all of our time in Mexico has been all around central Mexico and the south of Mexico. So we've had a good experience because we've probably stayed far away from where, as far as we understand, the cartels are more active in the northern states closer to the American border. And yeah, we have mostly pleasant things to say. There are, of course, just like any other place, like some things that we didn't enjoy. That's okay. Yeah, that's not something that we've...
$10 for ice cream.
That's crazy. Yeah. The best about Mexico. Okay, all right, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, like, there are lots of good things to say in Mexico City. We spent a lot of time there. I also had the good fortune of being able to invite my family there to meet my wife in Mexico City, and we had a wonderful time. Just going around, checking out the different museums. The Fine Arts Palace was really cool, has different exhibits all the time. Generally there's a lot, if you want to learn things, there is a lot available in Mexico City. There are also all of the conveniences that, we could want for the most part, lots of good stuff to eat. I'm used to having, and I appreciate having in the US, and so, there's no major compromise there. Rent is a little bit more expensive there, but we've also seen so many wonderful things, in especially like archaeological sites outside of Mexico City, like in Oaxaca, in especially the peninsula, the Yucatan Peninsula. Lots of places there. We only saw like a meager few of them. And yeah, so I don't know, we have a lot of good things to say about Mexico. It has not been an unpleasant experience spending, the better part of the last 3 years there. So, to live, to explore, have a fun touristy vacation. We've had less of that. So, if you're interested in, places like the resorts in Cancun or, whatever have you, like, we know less about that, but, there's a lot of good things to say about Mexico, and we've really appreciated our time there.
Right, now it's my turn. Explaining a little bit about the good stuff I experienced. As you know, because you have also spent time in Mexico during the past health crisis, I assume, since it's been probably like You know, I'm 21, 22, and 23. And for me, that's when it started because I was always looking to go back to Asia. But Asia was very closed during the past health crisis, you know. Even if you had a residence permit, you could not get in. So I was looking at a much more realistic alternative. And so I was like, And obviously living in southern Texas, you know, it's not too far to get into Mexico. And I was like, well, what if I drove my car across the southern border? You know, I don't know where to, but I was looking at this more and more. Obviously, I didn't do it immediately because you always are thinking about it twice, you know. So, but then I ended up, I did the import for my car, which was valid for 6 months. And then I ended up driving my car from McAllen, Texas to Veracruz, Mexico, which is about an 11-hour trip. It's beautiful. You drive through Tampico, which is nice. It's also a city by the ocean. Stopped there, had some food, and I did all of this with my dog. It's not that. That was fun. It was very, very convenient to do because you could just cross into Mexico without having proof of vaccination. Now, that was 2021, I believe. And then also did in 2022. I did it every year, actually, 2021, 2022, and 2023 too, right? And so I ended up just doing road trips into Mexico. And that was fun, you know, doing it like for a few weeks or a few months. And I think that was a very good time. And I learned that a country like Mexico was very open during a pandemic, you know. They didn't ask any questions. And like to each their own, you know what I mean? But like to me, back then, it sounded like a much better mousetrap than following all these requirements getting into Asia. That just didn't feel right to me. So I ended up just driving my Chrysler into Mexico. That was good. I made some stops, for instance, in a place called Orizaba, which was very nice. And that only happened because I was going by car. You know, when you fly, you don't have the option to stop. Yeah. You would have to rent a car and then go there. So I ended up stopping in a lot of places, and that was very delightful. You know, like seeing a lot of places that you don't really hear people talking about on the internet. Not on YouTube, not on Google, like, I've never heard of this place. Let's stop there. And I did. And that was like one of the coolest experiences, just being there for like half a day. You know, I remember arriving there probably at around like 2 p.m. or so. And then I ended up staying for a couple hours. They had a really nice park there. I just enjoyed it, you know. It's a magical town, Pueblo Mágico. It was just brilliant, you know. And then I drove my car from Orizaba to Veracruz, the port city, where you also spend time, right? The first time I was there was on a Friday night. Oh, that was great. You know, like the first time, think about it, the first time in Asia, eating with chopsticks, you know? It's like the first time you experience this, it's like, it feels so good, so different, so unique, you know? Wow, great. And I ended up going back there a few times, like I said. And I think that was probably my best experience being in Mexico. I really enjoyed Veracruz. Let's talk about the not so good experiences. What was a not so good experience, you know, where you would say, oh, I wish I didn't experience that in Mexico?
Also, my not so good experience is probably more targeted towards one Mexican company and specifically one employee. But my very first time in Mexico, so being Russian, in general, I feel like also my experiences in Latin America in general have been good, but I can't really say for sure if it was because I'm traveling with my American husband or if it's because, you know, I look old enough to not be looking for a sugar daddy in all of these places or something, because unfortunately that's, you know, the stereotype that follows Russian girls around, and that's especially so when we are younger and we're unmarried. And, you know, there is this poem by Rosario Castellanos, a Mexican poet. When I was studying in that course that I mentioned earlier, we actually talked about it and how she has this one poem where she talks about how she achieved the title of a señora. And so, you know, being a señora, so like Mrs., is completely different from being a Miss. And I was telling my professor that, you know, I don't know what it's like for a Mexican woman going outside of Mexico, but it's definitely like that for us, especially in terms of crossing the border, getting a visa. And so being an unmarried woman from a Slavic country, no matter what you look like, even if you don't look Slavic like myself, you will still be very much subject to that stereotype. And so I don't know if my experiences are mostly, you know, thanks to the fact that I'm married and my husband is actually traveling with me me most of the time, that I didn't really have a lot of experiences crossing the border myself. But so the very first time we stayed in Mexico, that was the time when Mexico transitioned from having the FMM form, so the migratory card, the yellow card that they gave you at the border. It was the only time that we entered Mexico and we got those cards, and after that they got canceled like maybe 1 month after we entered Mexico for the first time, and so we didn't need them anymore. And the next 2 times I entered just on the digital permit. So we don't really have a visa-free policy with Mexico. We have a digital visa that is valid for 6 months. So basically it's the same as the Americans traveling visa-free, but I do technically need a visa that I apply for like a few days before I cross into Mexico. So I had that paper, they stamped that paper, then they gave me the yellow FMM form, and well, basically I stayed in Mexico for 5 months, and then we were gonna leave. And the second they saw my passport at that one company's, so it was the counter where you could only go after you already paid the fee for choosing the seats. So it was like really just a really rare and really weird experience. The company's name is Volaris. Never fly with them if you have a choice, because Volaris, yeah. So it was really weird that, like, I understand that, there are a lot of low-costers out there, and if you tell anybody, they will be like, well, it's the same in my country, for example. Yeah, like, we have one in Russia that is very bad as well, I agree. But, look at Avianca, look at Copa. Those are not some private jet companies. They are normal economy class companies that offer affordable, good services for people like us, and you will never be looked down at. They will never see your passport and just judge you by the country you come from, which was exactly my experience there, because she sees my passport and she's just immediately suspicious. And I'm there with my husband. We entered on the same day. It was our first country in the Spanish-speaking part of Latin America. The first one was Brazil in Latin America, and then we flew directly to Mexico with a layover in Colombia. So basically, like our travel history at that point was exactly the same. It was after that he went to the US, there was some moving around when I was on my own in Latin America. But back then, you could clearly see that, I entered together with him, and it wasn't at all different for any reason. And so she got really suspicious. Then I showed her all of my papers, and she still took all of them to some immigration officer or someone, and she only let me go after she verified that everything was in order. And I told her that, I entered on this day. I still had, so it was, I think, early December that we were leaving Mexico, and I had at least until late January, if not even early February, to stay on my 180 days permit. And she still was just very suspicious. She wanted to verify it with the immigration officer. And after all that, there was no eye contact. So basically, the second she saw a Russian passport, I was downgraded to some basically illegal immigrant trying to overstay in Mexico. Yeah, when the person at the counter next to her asked what's going on, they have 180 days, she just showed her my passport so that she could see the cover that, it says Russian Federation, and yeah, so what? And think about it, Mexico allows you to enter with even the green card. So for example, for me right now that I'm going through the American immigration, why would I ever fly with this company if I have the green card? They will allow me to just enter like an American enters. So in the future, if I already invest in, time and effort in getting stable permanent residency somewhere else, and I just want to enter Mexico for a vacation, and you just judge me by the cover of my passport when I actually do have a legit reason to enter, visa-free, for example, not having whatever other document that you might want from me, because you don't know what the rules are for people, with my background. I just really don't understand that. And I at least come from a country that actually has an 180-day policy with Mexico, whereas, a lot of my students, a lot of my friends, they come from former USSR republics. They do need a visa to enter Mexico. And so for them, if they have a residency, especially a green card in the US, for example, traveling to Mexico will be much easier, because that is what will make them qualify for visa-free entry for 180 days. And so imagine if these people who come from a less privileged country than my own, for example, when they don't have that, just, oh, she has a Russian passport, 180 days for her. Then, you enter, you have a green card, you enter with the green card, and then you are treated like you are some illegal immigrant who just crossed illegally, when you actually have all the right to be there, because those are the norms, the rules of the Mexican immigration. So it's not really Mexico, it's just this one one person with this one company that was just ridiculous. And the second time I was leaving Mexico, I was already flying with Avianca, and we have never purchased any other tickets from that company ever again. Like, I love Avianca, and I got a new passport. So imagine, I had a passport that was about to expire. I applied for my new international passport in Mexico with my consulate, my embassy in Mexico City. I got the new passport, and so I was leaving Mexico already on the new passport, and I gave them both passports, and I said, I entered with this passport, and I'm leaving with this one because I will be entering Guatemala already with the new passport. No questions asked. Took like 3 minutes for me to leave. So that really leads me to believe that it's this company that I assume is probably a Mexican company that just doesn't really educate their employees on what the rules are, that couldn't handle my case as well as a Colombian company that literally just have, like some counter for like 20 minutes before the flight for me to just get on, and then maybe there will not be even a representative of their company present there, and they could handle it like that.
All right. My worst experience, one of the worst, was when I flew with Viva Air, if you know that airline. Mm-hmm. And I took a flight from Reynosa to Veracruz, a direct flight. And I think they only had one a day. They had more flights, but it was with a layover in Mexico City or Guadalajara, so I didn't want to take that because it was like going to be 8 to 11 hours. So I always took, I think, the very early morning flight. And I booked a return flight from Reynosa to Veracruz. And I was flying with a pet in the cabin. When I was flying, from Reynosa to Veracruz, there was no issue. In terms of weight, they did put the bag on the scale and there was no issue. My dog is a little bit big, so technically he can turn around in the bag. Whether that's uncomfortable to him or not is a whole other question, right? But on the first flight, there was no issue going to Veracruz. But then flying back from Veracruz to Reynosa, an issue arose. It was at the check-in counter. They told me, this dog is too big for the bag. That doesn't work. But then I explained to them, that's how I arrived here a couple of weeks ago. And now you're telling me I can't fly back the same way with the same bag and the same dog. This just doesn't add up. And then they made a big circus out of it. And I told them, I showed them my residency card for the US, and I told them, well, if you don't let me fly, I can't get back. That's the truth, because I didn't drive there that time. I flew. So how was I supposed to get back? There was just no option. And then I ended up arguing with them, and they were like, well, in terms of weight, you're good. He cannot turn around comfortably. And then, it's just, but they ended up letting me fly because I told that person that if you have some empathy in your heart, you're going to let me fly, because you are going to understand that if I came here the same way and I showed them the proof through the flight ticket that I booked the pet for the entire trip, and then started thinking, it's like, okay, that must be true. And then they just let me fly. But he told me that next time you don't fly anymore with this bag and your dog, because it just is not comfortable. But it didn't make sense because that airline allows, I think, 25 pounds. So that's obviously combined weight, the dog and the bag. And it had a lot less than that. It had 18 or 19. It just didn't make sense. He was just looking to create a problem where there was none. Because oftentimes, people are very bored at their workplace where they start looking for things that aren't a problem, He created a problem out of thin air. And technically, no dog can fully stand up in that bag unless it's like a Chihuahua, But any other dog, like a Pomeranian, for instance, it would be the same thing, maybe. So it just didn't make sense.
Based on my grandma's experience with the Chihuahua, my grandma is getting in that bag and Chihuahua is taking it. Because my grandma is pretty much a slave to her Chihuahua.
Anyway, I think it was the most annoying experience because it just didn't make sense. If there was a problem with the dog and the bag, they should have told me before I flew into Mexico. But saying that on the return flight was just weird. Anyway, that was my worst experience. What about yours? Was it the same with your wife, or was it something different?
I mean, that was pretty annoying, but I wouldn't say it was my worst experience. I guess our worst experience in general was kind of trying to figure out a way around some rules for our situation, and that was all theoretical, but it was it was like several months of just kind of like dreading the possibility of having to go up to the northern border for, our situation again. Thankfully, we don't have to deal with that, but I feel like it's, not really fair to say that that was the worst experience, because, it was our own personal interpretation of what things are going to be like, but there was so much guesswork, and, just we've heard nothing very good about, like, right up close to the US border, because
I think that could be very helpful for Americans who are married to Mexicans, actually. So I think you should tell me in more details, because there are a lot of people who cross, the border, like the wife is in Mexico, for example, and people live in like Texas, so it'd be helpful.
Okay, well then, I can share some details about that, just the worst experience of being in Mexico and the possibility of having to go to the northern border for, in our case, it would have been her immigration interview, U.S. immigration interview, but I'll share another personal experience afterwards. But so the whole thing was just that Mexico has several places within Mexico that you can deal with immigration, but the only place that they have where potential immigrants can go for their immigration interview is right at the border with El Paso, Texas, in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. In our situation, like, we've read that, for reasons that my wife has kind of alluded to when she was talking about her issues of, kind of the stereotypes and prior experiences that other countries have had with especially younger Slavic women, it's harder for her specifically to get to the border, because the authorities won't really trust her. They'll think she's going to try and hop the border, which she obviously wouldn't do, because that would endanger her possibility of, having a legal immigration via our marriage. But anyway, and so we wouldn't be able to board a flight directly there. So we would have to find ground transportation there. But that's a whole nother thing, because there's no direct route there. If there was, I think we would have a similar sort of issue where, they'd look at her passport and, be like, what are you going to do right at the border with the US, huh? And then, so we found I don't know how many different routes. So we were going to take a bus to somewhere kind of close to a northern state, and then try and find some kind of minivan that might take some trips up to another city where they have a train that goes across a bunch of the northern states that's very touristy, and then from one of the stops we could get off and take another bus to Ciudad Juarez. It was something like that. It was all theoretical, so I don't remember all the details, but it was crazy. And then just reading about other people's experiences trying to do something similar to this, from what we've read, we don't have any personal experience, but from what we've read, there's kind of a gradient the further north you go in Mexico, where the Mexican authorities start to kind of lose their authority, and the cartels kind of run things more or less. We're not sure. Again, we haven't been to the northern states, so personally we have nothing to speak of, but from what we've read, that could be the case. So one of those, little hops over somewhere might have had to include bribing some authorities to allow her to just continue on her journey, which is crazy. I wouldn't want to do that. And then just the fact that all of most of the cartel activity is centered around the US border, because that's, how it's part of the business, right? It just had us worried the whole time about what would happen if we get there. How would we get there? And then is there an actual possibility of something dangerous happening to us?
Wait time's over a year.
And the wait time is over a year, yeah, just to get the interview. In the news, we see a lot of bad stories about cartel activity. In most of Mexico, you wouldn't experience that. But in the north of Mexico, right across the border, that is where the cartels actually are, more present, more active, and where there have been stories of, people getting kidnapped, people's cars getting jacked, some people getting killed. And so, it might not happen to us, but just the all the thoughts running wild as we had to plan our precarious journey up there was horrible. It was months on end of just just like what could happen. So that was horrible. That sucked. But it wasn't an actual like experience that we had in Mexico. So, you could kind of chalk it up to like this is speculation. It's possible that you could just board a flight and the authorities will let you go. It's possible you could even get a bus right up there and it'd be fine. It's possible that if we stayed for, 2 weeks in Ciudad Juarez, we'd have no issues and, it'd be a different story now. But from all the information that we had available to us, like it was such we didn't really know what to expect, and there have been bad things that have happened to people who tried doing what we were going to. So yeah, that has been like the worst experience so far related to Mexico. In terms of our personal experience, most of our time in Mexico has been really safe, even just like going out walking the city streets at night has been pretty safe. And that's been the case in most of Mexico. Of course, like there are drunk drivers, just like there are drunk drivers everywhere. But we had one personal experience with a drunk driver in a more touristy city called Playa del Carmen. And it was just, I don't think it happens that often. But we were walking home one night, and we were not the only ones on that street. There was a family across the way, maybe a block down or something. At least like 3-4 kids. It was maybe like 10 people in total or something, and then, so we're on the left, they're on the right, and then there is this guy that comes like blazing through, and I don't know what happens. He like tries taking a turn over a median, and he does, but he runs into some bushes. It is right next to that family, and then like I think he realizes that people just saw that, and he drives away. Thankfully, in his inaccuracy, he ran into a bush or the curb or something, whatever. But one of those things took off the front bumper, which just happened to have his license plate. So I'm pretty sure he was pretty easily, yeah. So hopefully that should have had a pretty easy resolution, but it was a pretty scary experience, especially with kids nearby. But thankfully, it only happened once. The only time we really felt unsafe in a place in Mexico.
Also, one thing that I think escaped from Josh's story was just that it was also very stressful and very scary for all the Mexican people there, because you could just really see how and that was right around Day of the Dead. So like the Yucatan Peninsula doesn't really celebrate the Day of the Dead the way we as foreigners are usually used to thinking about it. Like it's not Oaxaca, it's not Mexico City, so it's not a major celebration, but they still have the altar out, and so basically people were just remembering their dead. They were sitting on the road with their kids, like all together, maybe sharing some memories or something. And right after this accident happened, like you could see that like everybody was holding their kids near them, and like it really ruined like the mood for everybody that night. But also just like exactly, I really thank God for looking over all of their shoulders, because seriously, that would be such a horrible tragedy on that very supposedly peaceful night before that happened. And just also he just drove away, and like
that was an act of God.
Yeah, that was just yeah. So I think the fact that like I think that there is a little bit more drunk driving going on in Mexico in general. Even one of our friends, there was this really weird experience we had, and it's mostly just that even the restaurants, they kind of encourage you to drink and drive, which was really weird to us, because we went to this restaurant with this family we knew in Puerto Vallarta, where also a lot of foreigners go for vacation. And it was really weird because the family friend that we went with, he knew the owner of the restaurant, and they just kept tequila shots coming, and he was like, "No, I'm driving, and just one." And so like this kind of experience, I understand that it's a family acquaintance, maybe like they're trying to be polite, but like if he's driving, just leave him alone. And unfortunately that was the case. That they kept offering, he drank a few, and then you sit at the back of his car and you're thinking, my last ride, maybe. Time to say goodbye. And so I think that unfortunately we've seen that more in Mexico than we have in a lot of other places. And I think it could be sometimes because of the roads, like mountain roads also going up, right? Like in Puerto Vallarta, around that area, there are a lot of very dangerous roads. And then if literally at any restaurant you could possibly go, there's a possibility of a free drink that will be forced on you, then well, you're risking much more. Even if you don't drink and drive, you might run into one of those drunk drivers on your way home or your way to work. So that's another issue that I think is something to be really careful about in Mexico.
Thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next video.